Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Gary Huntley. I want to welcome you to episode 2 of our State of Vegetation Management. Today, we'll be focusing on utility wildfire. From our previous session, we had several participants ask us to address this very important topic. And so on this episode, we will do exactly that. As I mentioned, I'm Gary Huntley. I'm a retired vice president of distribution services from Entergy Corporation. I worked there a little over 20 years. I had also almost 12 years with the Chevron Corporation. And so more than 32 years in the energy business in and of itself. I'd like to introduce two of our panelists today who are going to be more of the experts around the wildfire issue that we're going to talk about today. We have with us today, we have Ms. Holly Woodings. Holly is with United Power. And Holly, if you wouldn't mind, would you just give us a brief background on yourself, please?
My name is Holly Woodings. I'm with United Power. I'm the Mountain Area Manager for their Mountain District. We are in Colorado, just north of Denver, west of Boulder, Mountain District. We have about 5,700 members in our Mountain District and total of just over 100,000 members total. I've been in the electric utility industry for over 20 years now and very happy to be here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Holly. And also we have with us today, we have Mr. Dave James. Dave James is with Avista Corporation. Dave, would you give us a little more brief introduction for yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I'm the wildfire manager here at Avista. Avista serves Northeast Washington and Northern Idaho. We have about 400,000 customers, and we have a gas company as well. Pretty similar numbers. And we have some properties down in Oregon. I've been on this wildfire journey since early 2019, and we're now on our second iteration of our plan, and we've got most of our programs up and running. It's just been very gratifying to see the company come behind and really support this initiative. And for those of us in what I would call fire country, it was a long time coming because we've had different approaches and programs, but they've never been pulled together as a holistic program before the last few years.
Thank you, Dave. And again, it really is my pleasure to host this platform today. So today we will be, again, focusing on wildfire mitigation and resiliency. In the previous session that we had in the state of vegetation management, we talked about vegetation management in general. And while we all know that vegetation management has long time been one of the largest O&M spends for utilities, but now more than ever, we are seeing customer expectations on reliability and also liability concerns as additional headwinds. And so today, we want to address those issues specifically with the angle towards wildfires. Why are utilities now so focused on wildfires? When it seems like not very long ago, it wasn't as big of a deal, certainly not on the national and international scene. So let's start with Holly. Holly, what do you see? What's changed? Why now do we see so much focus on wildfires for utilities?
To me, I feel like a lot of it has to do with the drought, climate change, weather conditions have changed. I know in 2020, Colorado experienced 3 of the largest wildfires in the state's history. And then also in December of 2021, we had the most destructive wildfire, although it was small, it was only 6,000 acres. It destroyed over 1,084 residential structures. There was approximately 7 commercial structures. So that one has now become the most destructive wildfire or grassland fire. So I think it's just becoming more apparent to the utilities, to the public, that we need to address it. And being that we're electric providers in rugged terrain, I know Dave can attest to that. It's not always easy to get to our power lines prior to or during a fire. So anything we can do to reduce the risk is overall beneficial for everyone.
Good deal. Thanks, Holly. Dave, your perspective?
Yeah, you can't have one of these discussions and not address the 2018 Paradise Fire. I mean, I think a lot of utilities were in the mode of thinking as fire. I know that fire was at the top of our risk registry. We had recognized that fire is our highest financial risk. But it wasn't until the Paradise Fire that I think utilities coalesced around this idea that, okay, we've got to have holistic plans and approaches for this. And so we put together our plan. That was in July of 2020. September 2020, I'm not sure how widespread this was, but in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, we had 40 and 50-mile-an-hour winds over Labor Day weekend. And in that season, you're at the end of a very long dry season. And we had 28 fires in our service territory, and one of them destroyed an entire community. So it was really, I think, a poignant statement to how devastating these fires can be. And the climate has changed. We have a lot more people that live in fiery areas. And even though we take solace in that utilities are only causing 4 to 6% of all wildfires, we're very low in the scale of what causes wildfires. When you look at what causes fires on very windy days, when winds are blowing 30, 40, 50 miles per hour, then all of a sudden utilities jump way up on that list. And so those are the incidents. It's not the everyday fire, it's the fire on the very windy day in the summer that utilities really need to brace against. So it's a low probability event, but can have very traumatic impact. That's why we're so engaged in this topic.
Yeah, thank you both for that. As I think back and living in New Orleans, Louisiana, certainly wildfires is not one of the things that I've had to really deal with in my profession. But I will say, I think another aspect of this is that with the advent of social media, everybody now is a reporter. You see a lot of the people are taking their pictures and they're much more engaged. So people will take more to social media. So to your point, I think, Dave, that while utilities might only make up a small percentage of it, I certainly do believe because of the liability and those things that both you and Holly mentioned, that is just getting more exposure and people are able to get pictures of their homes and neighborhoods out in front of everyone as these events are unwinding. So with that, so how important is veg management to wildfire mitigation, Dave? You were talking a little bit about the liability, but how important is veg management to wildfire mitigation?
Yeah, it's really number one. If we just did one thing, it would be to invest more in our vegetation programs. And I think there are a couple of themes that we're going to touch on today. One is traditionally utilities did only cycle-based trimming. They would figure out how many miles of line they had, and they would break that up into 4 or 5 or 6 year cycles, some lower or higher. And maybe there's some tweaks here and there, but today the technologies are allowing us to take a more risk-based approach where we can look at or use remote sensing technologies to really hone in on where are those areas where we have a lot of vegetation cover, producing a lot of outages. So we're getting a reliability hit, but also in those critical fire months, where are those areas where you have that combination of heavy fuel regimes and people and a lot of housing. So this has really changed the calculus for us. And my company does a lot of tracking with respect to what kind of tree-related outages are we seeing. And we know that trees are falling into our lines 4 or 5 times as higher than they are growing in. So the idea of identifying tree health, those trees that are in decline that are more likely to topple into power lines, that's really become the focus, really the number one focus of what we're doing with our fire plan is on the risk tree side.
Thank you, Dave. And it sounds as well as the tree health that, those trees that are maybe outside of your right of way, but in proximity to your power lines will also be ones to try to keep an eye on. Holly, I know you mentioned the terrain, right? Some of the challenging terrain that you have in your area. Can you speak to the vegetation management as a problem there?
What we're working on is being able to get to those areas when weather conditions allow. So we're working on our cycle trims, but because the vegetation management is fairly new, so cycle trims and getting rid of our hazard trees, but also being able to know which trees or which areas we need to trim for the entire year so that we can plan our vegetation management around those. And then reducing the hazardous vegetative fuels, is very key, I think. And so we have implemented several different programs up here to help our community, partnered with local fire departments, Office of Emergency Management, to also reduce that. Because I don't necessarily think it's the tree that's going through the line that will cause the fire, but it's everything also underneath the line that's just as hazardous. So that's been very productive and successful.
Thank you, Holly. And I think so. Both of you talked about the hazard trees and grow-ins and fall-ins. And in terms of next steps and what steps you're taking, I think what I've heard, Holly, you talked about, I guess there's a timing of when you implement some of the programs around vegetation management. What does that look like for you from a planning? I think from what I gathered from your comment, I'm appreciating the actual execution part of that. But from a planning perspective, how much time goes into that? When do you really start in that robust of planning to get the work done and then trying to get it done when the weather permits?
We've created the plan for the whole year. So what areas need to be trimmed. And then we've also done a risk analysis so we can see not only which feeder needs to have the vegetation trimmed or removed from it, we can also dial it in more to see what 3 spans have like the larger grow-in rate or hazard tree risk. And that way we can do both the cycle trim and then the hotspot areas and get down to actually like where our risk is. And I can have that information for the entire year so that we can plan, based on the weather conditions. We seem to have our heavy wet snow in the spring. So right about this time of the year, which also includes very high winds. Like Dave was saying, last year we had 100-mile-an-hour winds. They come off the canyon. So we have extreme winds and snow. The heavy wet snow, you drive around and every tree looks like it's in the lines, but being able to have it actually calculated out makes it more efficient versus just driving.
Good deal. And Dave, what about you, Dave? What steps are you guys taking to identify and mitigate those risks that you talked about?
Yeah, we're using a variety of technologies. We're using LiDAR on the transmission system, and we're using what they call the rapid flight. It's a low-level flight. I think it's 1,000 feet above the deck, usually with a helicopter. So we get the resolution of that imagery is fantastic. Works well for linear projection, so it works well for transmission. On the distribution side, we're not using LiDAR. We're using a satellite approach. But we're still mixing in traditional boots on the ground inspections as well. We're not fully transitioned over to any technology. I think we will probably be over on the LiDAR side sooner than on the satellite side. It took us a while to get the calendar shaped right. And now I think we're in a good zone where we're taking kind of the second half of the year to do the inspections and the assessment, doing the work planning through the winter, with the goal of having all of our risk trees off of the system. I know it's a monstrous lift to do that work in the first half of the year prior to our fire season. And unlike Holly, we have altitudes less than 1,000 feet in our system. I don't know what our average would be, but it's probably around 2,000. So we have some benefit of being at lower elevation and getting a lot of work done in those months of February, March, and April, really in that first quarter on the removal side.
Okay, good deal. And I think I hear you talk about some of those activities, the planning, and certainly it sounds like you're not just being reactive, right? You're being proactive and reactive once you have that information. But Holly, you talked about a little bit about interacting with other groups. So, obviously there's processes that both of you talked about. I think Dave, you talked a little bit more about the technology with the LiDAR and satellite. And Holly, you mentioned something, I think it goes along the lines of community communication. Those are some of the things you mentioned. Are there any other things that go into this resiliency planning that both of you may want to mention? Dave, I'll start with you. So, we've got a little bit around technology, around process. Talk to me a little bit about maybe the community and the customer interactions that are important, or just anything else that you think are important parts of building a really good, sustainable resiliency plan.
Yeah, we've been focused on vegetation, but last year we conducted holistic community outreach. It was very structured, and we drew from a lot of knowledge base within our corporation. So we had a lot of hands into this plan, but it included things like meeting with Department of Emergency Management. And when you do that, you often get fire agencies, police, even ambulance service, if you're in that realm. So now you're dealing with professional peers, and they have a very different focus, different mission, but we look at them as our partners. They are vital to our mission. And then on the customer side, we've been really happy with our telephone town halls. In addition to things like social media, all this stuff that's one-way communication for the most part, press releases, TV ads. I think the best thing that we did last year is when we had these telephone town halls, we were able to reach out to thousands of customers. And we didn't get them all on the phone, right? But we got almost 3,000 on the phone. And that was just a great way to get messages out and to get, because it's the same question over and over. If someone asks a question, there are 100 people that are thinking that same question. So one person's brave, right? And they ask the question and you answer it. And it was a really good exchange. It felt really good. We got great feedback from customers. I thought it was going to be a little more contentious because when you give people an open mic in a forum, right, you never know where they're going to come from. But it's something that we're going to build on. We invited, I think, 36,000 customers last year, and now we're looking at more like 80,000. That would be all of the customers that live in what we would consider high fire threat. The telephone town hall, that was a home run for us.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that obviously the communication piece of that is big and probably one of the hardest ones to manage. You never really know how many what questions you're going to get, but I think you raised a good point. A lot of people are thinking along the same lines, and so I think it's good that they all get the same at the same time. Holly, what about you? Anything else in the resiliency plan that you want to mention in that regard?
I would agree with Dave, like getting out there with your local entities. We have several different local fire departments in our area, in our territory. So we've partnered and collaborated on different events, but getting out to know your Office of Emergency Management, the Sheriff Department and whatnot, just being a face in the community is very key. Being proactive and knowing who to contact if there is actually an emergency, I think this is the resiliency as well, because it's not so much when the emergency happens, it's if an emergency happens, you want to make sure that all your contacts are up to date. And so I think that getting involved with the community any way that's possible is an important part of that. And then also, I think then the community is more confident that if an emergency happens, then they're at least in good hands. They know that we are all there to support them, and they're not just, it seems like it would be maybe more organized chaos.
Yeah, it certainly will be chaos. And I think that the key is to be as prepared as you can. We never know which direction really the wind's going to blow. And even though we get these predictions, we know that things can change very quickly. It sounds like both of you have had good experiences with the outreach. And so it also struck me as both of you were commenting that as you reach out to these partners, I think your partners knowing what you're doing helps them too with their planning, where to go, when to go. They may have things. I like the comment about the firefighters. They're the experts, right, in this. And then Holly, to your point about the communications, it's like if everybody is on the same page, they know what your plans are. You have the best plan of attack and you communicate that, then it seems to me that's going to put you in the best position to be successful, because the communication is key, right? When people know what you're doing, where you're doing, it makes it easier for people to say, hey, when they need to move, what they need to prepare for, and that coordination can actually save lives. So I think that part is very good. I'm going to pause real quickly and see if there are any. Evan, do we have anything here that we need to address just quickly before I move to the next part of this?
Actually, Gary, we did get a question that came in, and it's just asking about PSPs, public safety power shutoffs, and just if you guys could speak to any of your experience with those.
I can say real quick because mine will be might be a short answer. Currently, we are not doing public safety power shutoff yet. We do have red flag warning days because, like I said, we do have high winds both in our mountain district and our plains district. High winds, dry conditions. We've already had several red flag days this early spring or late winter, however you want to call it. We do adjust some of our settings in our substations on those cases, but as I'm sure that we move forward, things may change, but for right now, we haven't done it.
Okay. Dave?
Yeah, we've never initiated one. We've had 3 different examinations of PSPS and how it might work for our system. And I think we will adopt it. I think it'll become part of our plan, but it'll be a bolt on top of our fire safe mode. So we have a pretty elaborate system in place to monitor circuits down to the recloser level And when those reclosers hit certain fire risk ratings, then we change settings, and we have a couple of different levels for that. And we've been really happy with how that is working, because it's balancing that reliability versus the fire risk. And certainly there are situations that warrant really going to the maximum. We know we're going to take a hit on reliability, but produce far fewer explosive wildfires. But on the PSPS side, I think most of the utilities in my neck of the woods would categorize that as that's a measure of last resort for us. I think that's what will happen here as well. And I think California utilities are trending that way now. You're starting to see that language from them. Hey, this is the thing that we do last. And we have all these other steps that we're going to do before we get to a PSPS. And that wasn't the case back in 2019, 2020. They were using it pretty liberally. But no one's really happy when their power is shut off proactively, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I think there the key messages there are really around life and equipment, right? And probably in that order in terms of the why you have to do it. But you're right, Dave. I don't think that message, albeit for the right reasons, is usually not very received, to say the least. All right, let's transition to the next piece here. So, Dave, you talked a little bit about the moving from a traditional cycle trim, right? You talked about the average cycle trim. And I know you made mentions about LiDAR and satellite. Can you just give us in practice, what does it look like? And maybe even just a little bit about what the benefits you've seen from moving away from that cycle approach.
Yeah, the cycle approach, it works. It's easy. Utilities have been doing it forever. But when you do that, you are assuming a uniform risk across your system, and that's just not the case. And so now that we have better GIS systems, better outage management systems, we're able to leverage those programs and really start assigning that risk. So it's not so much of a, gosh, we should do this because every 3 years we need to go visit the circuit. It's really about, where are we seeing those reliability hits? Where do we know we have a lot of vegetation cover and fast growing species, wet type forests, and pulling that information together with inspection. So the inspection is a part of that overall playbook. And that's what it takes. Corporations are slow. It's a big ship, and there's a lot of history here. We've been around. I think we just celebrated our 135th birthday, and they've been trimming trees since year one. So it takes a while for things to turn and for groups and individuals to align with a kind of a different way of thinking. But we're getting there. It's been very gratifying to see our individuals start embracing the technology and seeing the benefits of the time saving that it creates for them. So I think that's the win for our field folks, is that where they get sent, yeah, it needs help. There's no more of this. Let's go out there and take a look and trim what you think needs to be trimmed. It's no, we're sending you to a specific location to do a specific job, and that's been very helpful.
Yeah, you raised some very good points on that. And certainly that time piece of it is really important. Holly, what about you? What are you seeing in terms of in practice when you make that switch, and what benefits do you see?
So I think one benefit, so we are using satellite imaging for our vegetation management. Like I said, allowing us to do our cycle trim in addition to analyzing the risk. So we can basically tackle both, removing the vegetation from underneath the line, clearing, the right of ways, creating a sustainable right of way, but also then finding the specific areas where we have the most risk. And whether it's the tree grow in or the dead tree that we may not spot on a normal, whether you're hiking out there or binoculars or whatnot, but using the satellite to give you an overall bird's eye view of what our system looks like has been extremely beneficial. We implemented that in 2021 because prior to that, we didn't have very much records, even though we've been around for a long time. Dave mentioned with Avista, there wasn't a lot on the books. And so being able to have an overall view of what our system looked like and where our densely forested areas, what we needed to tackle first, and then dialing in on the risk. It's been very successful so far.
Yeah, good deal. It sounds like when I think about the terrain that you mentioned, clearly there's a sort of a risk component of that, right? If you're able to remotely get that information versus trying to get boots on the ground in some of these more difficult areas. In 2019, when I first started using this satellite technology, there were a couple of other benefits that I saw as well. That Dave, you mentioned the risk part of it. And I see it this way: when you have the least amount of information and you're asking a contractor to perform the work, they will price in the risk, right? We've seen that on construction side and we see that on vegetation management. So that we spend a lot more time collecting as accurate information as we can before we put together bid packages. And that's where you usually get the better pricing. Vegetation management is not any different. I think certainly the LiDAR and satellite technology both allow you to collect that information in a manner that I think is very useful so that your contractors have more confidence in what the work is that needs to be performed. And I think you get better pricing. Look, certainly over the last 2 years, we've all seen with inflation, we've seen costs go up in our business. We've seen people retire who've had 20 plus years of experience from not just vegetation management, but all parts of the utility. And when you see that skill set being replaced, those costs are going up. And in vegetation management, it's just harder to find people to come into that space, and certainly people with experience. So I do think the technology is a way to help offset some of those costs, and that the time, I think, Holly, you mentioned the time benefit of this is one too that's well noted. All right, we're talking about this from remote sensing, right? So you've got LiDAR, you've got satellite. Let's talk about how that plays into the wildfire mitigation. We're talking about vegetation management in general, but Holly, would you start with how do you see this new technology playing into your wildfire mitigation and resiliency plans?
So we have another module on the system that we use. We actually utilize AI Dash for the vegetation management. So there are certain areas, what I like to refer to as the desert forest, where we may not have any vegetation. So we might not have any trees out there. So being efficient with your time and knowing that we don't necessarily have to send a contractor to that area because there isn't any vegetation. The satellite imaging will also catch, though, if there's a few trees in just one near a member's home or whatnot. So we're able to utilize that and leverage that information and get just maybe that one hazard tree that might be there. We also, for remote sensing, we're also installing a wildfire camera at one of our peaks. I've teamed up with our Timberline Fire Protection District to do that. We've also teamed up with our Gilpin County Office of Emergency Management to do wildfire sensors. So it's the overall spectrum of the more information we have, remote sensing, whether it's vegetation management or different tools for wildfire mitigation, we can create a more robust network overall. So that's a little summary, probably off topic, apologize, but we've done a lot we've done a lot of work up here, and I'm very proud of the work we've done.
I think that is right on topic. That's part of that remote sensing. It sounds like you've got some other sensors in place to detect. And of course, you've already mentioned some of the satellites. So I think that's right on point. What about you, Dave?
And I'm looking at one of the questions here about the timeliness of inspections. And one of the big takeaways for me when we started down the satellite imaging road is I can look at the whole system at one time. You can't do that with boots on the ground. It takes months. And sometimes you're spanning several seasons, right, to get an entire look at the system at huge cost. And when you use one of these technologies, maybe it's a couple of weeks of flight time if you're doing LiDAR, but satellite imagery just comes at once. And then there's some analysis that goes. So there's a time frame there, but what is delivered as a product is this is your system at a point in time. Oh, and in 6 months, you're going to get a new image and we'll be able to help you identify where you are, where you have risk of encroachment, and where tree health is an issue. That's been a game changer for us, thinking that, oh gosh, traditionally it took us 5 years to go around the entire system. That's not a system inspection. That's piecemeal. Now we get it all at once. It's been very helpful to us.
Yeah, and even in my experience, I'll just say the time that it takes to collect the information on an entire system. And when I was at Entergy, we had roughly 92,000 lines of distribution. And it was just amazing that I could collect that information in a very short period of time through the swamps, through the bluffs, the swamps in South Louisiana, through the bluffs in Mississippi and parts of Arkansas, and even the terrain in Texas. It was just a lot, right? And to have boots on the ground to do that, which was our traditional way of doing it, for that to get done. And keep in mind, that was with all the work that was already on top of our fees. And we had some contract foresters who helped us year round. It's just physically impossible. And then when you think about the type of information you get, I'm willing to bet you if I send two people out to look at a circuit, they're not going to come back with the exact same assessment. It may be close. Those who've got more experience, they may align a little more closely. And it's not to say that you won't get information that's useful, but the remote sensing does give you that. And one other piece of that, we talked about it briefly, but I think you can't, from a timing perspective, the turnaround of I'll call it the change in work plan. So we haven't talked about budgets a lot here, but all utilities seem to face the same challenge. Somewhere along the line of the year, you may be asked to cut budgets, or something happens in a regulator, or you may find that you have a little more to spend in the budget, and you get the question, how much can you do by the end of the year, or what have you, or a regulator might just give you that pressure to do that. And I found that using the technology, that remote sensing, allowed me to get that information faster and turn around the work plans to the contractors in a much more time efficient manner. That was a really good question on the time perspective of that. Really appreciate it. All right, let's see. Let's keep us moving here right along. We talked a little bit, I think earlier, we talked a little bit about the sensing, and we talked about engaging with customers and perhaps regulators. But really, what happens when a fire happens? Right? What's the first move? So we've got all this planning, Holly, you talked about throughout the year. What happens? So now we know we have an event. Your sensors are picking up. We have a fire in the area. What happens next, Holly? What's those first moves with you and your company?
So fortunately, we haven't actually had a fire in our territory since about 2002. However, doing practice runs, essentially knowing the GPS location of the wildfire, what direction it's going, the weather conditions, and then the potential impact, where the fire is going and who will be most impacted, so that we can notify the community and then also protect our infrastructure. I think that's very important. You don't want to shut down everyone's power if you don't have to, unless it's all in danger. Dialing into exactly where that fire is going and to be able to keep it safe, the area safe for our first responders, for our line workers, for anyone in the vicinity. I think that's key as far as response, just getting all the information that's possible. And there is a lot of technology out there to allow us to do that.
Good deal. What about you, Dave?
We have a lot of fires. So probably this was the easiest area of the plan to put together, because we had so much experience with tackling fires, working with fire agencies. I'll just give you some examples. Maybe this goes back too far. I was a newly minted engineer at the then Washington Water Power Company in October of 1991, when we had 100 days, no precipitation, right? 100 days. Everything's bone dry. It's in October. We're generally thinking that's the end of fire season. And then we had these 50, 60 mile an hour winds hit us from the Columbia base, created this big dust plume. We had 90 fires that day, and most of them were ignited from power lines. That was our initial wake-up call that, wow, we can be a big source of these fires. We've drawn some lines, though. We've drawn one of the lines that we've drawn is, we are not fire experts. And I think this is a good line, or good distinction to have if you're a utility. Know your lane. And our lane is electricity and response and restoration, and maintain that lane. But one of the things that we've done so much better is, we know that when fire is on scene, they command the scene. There's no more, let's go cowboy, we got to get these people back in power. Our first check is always with police and fire. And that has been so tremendously helpful for us. It's helped our reputation with our first responders. When I go to talk to them, there's always somebody in the room that's going to say, hey, I was on a fire last year and your guys showed up, and they were polite and professional, and they talked through the plan. We needed them to do a few things, and they just followed instructions. And every time I hear something like that, I just think, thank God. It's so gratifying when because we're consistently trying to message to our folks about their role in a fire response situation. What is your role? And your first role is personal safety. Take care of yourself. Do not become a statistic out there. It is definitely not worth it. And we've been able to do that. There's a big human side to this as well. And we've talked a lot about technology and ability to assign risk and to act appropriately. But at the end of the day, it's still people in chase and line and bucket trucks out there that are on the front lines of this thing. And you can't forget about them. Or if you do, they're going to remind you that they're really
Absolutely. Thank you both for that. Yeah, so when I hear you talk about the to the customers and really to the community and to the experts, the fire and the police, I think you both raised some important points. After this event, after a fire, during the fire, it's really important to stay well in touch with these folks. And I think one thing that the technology gives you the opportunity to do is it gives you the opportunity to get real-time information and get it very quickly that you can then share, right? So we all see on the national scene the weather reports, right? But we never see or hear about really the status of the equipment. Sometimes we see the status of people and it's really more anecdotal, see some pictures, but it's not really the entire community as perhaps you could see or region as you could perhaps see from satellite imagery or from having more LiDAR. And certainly giving you the ability to communicate the status of your system to your constituents, like you said, Dave. It's just the credibility piece of that is so important. All right, so let's keep it moving here. This is really good discussion around the fires, wildfire mitigation and resiliency. So we talked a little bit about what happens during the fire, and what about post-fire? Is there anything that needs to happen to get things stored quickly? We talked about with the authorities, but anything else to add there before we move on to regulation?
I would recommend doing like a lesson learned afterwards.
Okay.
When once
a
we've
good
all
point,
recovered, essentially, it's always good to go back and listen, because in the East Troublesome Fire in 2020, which is in northern Colorado, it was a ginormous fire. A year later, I got to hear one of the utility representatives speak about their experience, and I will do everything I can to mitigate that risk. But it's very interesting. It's good to get together and share information and what worked well and what didn't for the next time.
That's a really good point, Holly. And of course, as we know, none of these events are exactly the same, right? So each time there's a different nuance. I think it is an opportunity for us to learn it and perhaps get a little better about the way we plan and address these concerns. Thank you, Holly. What about you, Dave?
We certainly were interested in the after action reports, but I think way more important is the work on the front end, which is always the planning work in the early part of the season. It's more difficult to have a tangible thing that you're pointing to when you have a fire, and then you just all fingers point to how did that go. But coming into fire season to understand what are the points that need to happen, how can the utility be a better partner with our fire agencies. And I've been thinking this and not saying it, Gary, but one of the things that I've heard many times from fire professionals is they lean over and they say, it's good that you're getting to meet me today, because if you meet me when there's a bad fire, I'm going to be a grumpy person. You're not going to like me on that day. And that's been it's kind of interesting, because it's so true that if you wait to meet with your fire agencies on that really bad day, it's not going to go well. But if they know you or have heard of you and you're trying to be helpful, it's going to go a lot better. So you got to make that investment on the front end. Can't wait for the day.
That's a great point. I think, and we know in our business relationships matter, right? So I think just going through those drills and talking through plans and having had communications before the event, I really think having a relationship really goes a long way in terms of building trust, in terms of what happens next in the sharing of information. I think that's a really key portion of that. Thank you both for those responses. And so one of the questions we did get, there was a question about regulation and grants programs. Holly, I know that you had mentioned something at the very beginning around this area. Can you just share briefly with us if this is anything around the grants, programs, or regulations related to such?
The grants, I can. We recently partnered with Colorado Energy Office to apply for one of the DOE grants, United Power, along with 16 other surrounding utilities, which was it was an awesome experience to collaborate with the other utilities for wildfire mitigation. It's the new technology that's coming out, whether it's the satellite imaging for vegetation management or new devices in the field to reduce the wildfire risk, weather tool. But it's awesome for us as Colorado to have all of the utilities kind of supporting each other in addition to our state offices supporting each other, because the fire may not start in your territory, but doesn't mean that it won't come into your territory. So knowing
Right.
what your neighboring utility has and what you're doing seems to make it more cohesive. Like maybe we can create a resilient grid overall and not just be so focused on what we are doing as our own utility, because it's important what the neighbor's doing as well.
That's a very good point, Holly. Thank you. What about you, Dave? Anything around
Well,
grants or on regulations you
yeah.
want to mention?
Yeah, a couple of things. Of course, now that I guess it's part of the infrastructure bill, but a lot of us are involved in this grid resiliency innovation program. I think that's what GRIP stands for. And we're swinging for the fences, at least internally. We're going after almost 200 miles of undergrounding. And that's been one of those things that utilities just can't figure out how to do. How do we convert overhead lines to underground? New construction, yes. You don't put up overhead lines and new subdivisions anymore, and we rarely extend even our overhead laterals. Generally, that work is underground, but converting lines, that's a big deal. So we'll see what happens. It's a lot of money if we get it. What I did want to mention is we have a fuel reduction program with both the state of Idaho and Washington. And in many cases, those states are going after federal dollars, and it requires some portion, and it's generally not 50-50. A lot of times it's 90-10, but they require a partner for matching funds. So we put in 10%, they get 90%, and then we both benefit from the fuel reduction. In fact, in Idaho State has $0 for fuel reduction on their state-owned forests. And they're 100% reliant on federal grant money coming in. And so we've been able to leverage and help them attract more dollars. And in Washington, there is some state monies. But again, by us making what I would call pretty moderate investments, we're not spending a lot of money. We're able to leverage our dollars. And in some cases, we get a lot more work out of it than the money that we put in.
Oh, that's awesome. I think certainly for those communities you serve, to be able to help leverage and get dollars for them that benefits those communities, it's got to be pretty awesome. I'm sure there'll be other opportunities for grants. And to your point, I think we're going to all be watching to see from that GRIP program and others, just where that goes in terms of the actual funding. But I like the way you said it. You swing for the fences, you go after all those dollars and see what you can get. But obviously anything you get will be very beneficial. Thank you both for that. One last comment I'll make on this regulations, and then we'll get to the questions. We've heard a lot and we've read a lot over the last few about regulators, and particularly in California, and the whole issue on liability, right? And so we now see that they've codified some of those things around liability. So I think it's just very important as we talk about wildfires and we think about resiliency programs that we, to the point that both Dave and Holly made, just look at this from a risk mitigation perspective, but also just from a liability perspective. And so there are real cases out there about those actual dollar amounts. In California, it was in the billions of dollars. And there's just a lot out there. If you want to just Google it, I won't spend a lot of time, but I think it is important to look at what other regulators have done around liability and just get the sense for why it just makes the case more for the resiliency program on wildfires. Looking at the questions we had, we did have a question about with the increase of wildfire activities, what's the best way to strike a balance between a good ground cover undergrowth to keep the area under transmission lines from becoming too muddy and having too much ground cover that causes undue maintenance. I think, Holly, you mentioned that spring wet snow. Is that something that maybe you can address? I know this seems to be specific to transmission, but I didn't know if that was an area that you might be able to give us an answer on.
We do have some sub-transmission lines that run through our territory. Our mountain district is fed from one substation at the base of the canyon and then goes up to 4 other substations. So it's just this ginormous circle. We cleared out vegetation under several miles of that line. And there's this very cool little ground cover that grows as long as it's not suffocated by other things, but it allows for a beautiful, sustainable right of way. I think it's beautiful. If we can create some of the native grasses, like whether it's just maybe seeding in certain areas, but if we can bring back some of the native vegetation that's low growing and less of a risk, then it will also increase other, I don't know if you want to say bugs. You get the bees that come in and then they pollinate, and you can have a more diverse and, like I said, sustainable right away. So the vegetation is low growing and not at such a risk of growing up into our subtransmission lines, but it's still there, and the members like it, customers.
No, that's a great point. I think a lot of times we think about vegetation management, we think about it just strictly from removing vegetation. I think you raise a good point about the type of vegetation that we might want and prefer for various reasons. Dave, what about you?
Yeah, part of it is what you don't want in a transmission right away, correct? You don't want trees there. We've taken this approach that, yeah, there's a pruning and removal component, but we're also using tree growth inhibitors. We're also doing some spraying just to remove some of those juvenile trees, because you're going to have something grow there. And as Holly mentioned, if it can be low growing vegetation, it's still, there's a fire risk associated with anything that grows underneath lines, but if it's low growing and you can keep that fire flame length low and keep it out of the conductors, you're better off. But one of the things that we're doing with customers, this is on electric distribution, and this has been, utilities have had right tree, right place around forever, right? But I think in most situations it's more of a concept, and you try to get your customers to do it on their own. We flipped the script on that, and we're reaching out to our customers in high fire threat districts that we know have trees that are growing into power lines or could topple in. And we're essentially saying, we will remove that tree for free. Not everyone takes us up on that, right? But let us come in and remove that tree and replace it with something that will be beautiful, but we'll never have to trim. It's been, for those customers that we've engaged and that take us up on this, it's just been some of the best work that I've seen done here, because at the end of the day, we end up with a customer that looks at us much differently than just, oh, that's where I get my power. It's like, that customer, that utility helped me get rid of some of those trees that I was worried about, and now I've got these beautiful blossoming cherries and dogwoods that they'll never have to come trim. I don't want to have to come trim them, right? So that's been a fun example of how do you take fire resiliency and really hone in on those individual customers who are at greatest risk, because if that tree catches on fire, they're in trouble. It's been a great program. We're just getting started. Last year we kicked that off, and this year will be our second full year of having. We can't call it right tree, right place, Gary. We have to call it something else. It's STP. It's the Safe Tree Program. Yeah, STP.
Well, it does sound like a great program, and I think this is just another creative way to strike that balance between what customers want and what the utilities need to keep them safe and keep the assets safe as well. So we're at that time of wrapping up. I've got one last question. I think we actually answered it, but I'll just, for the audience, just address it. That question was, how is the vegetation management related work coordinated with other wildfire mitigation altogether? And I think you both have spoke a lot about the planning aspect of the year-round planning, and certainly you've talked about those engagements with others in the communities, and the ability to really collect that information a lot faster with the use of technology.